I'm Tammy, the Twisted Pearl Girl. So maybe you've been knitting for a while and mostly working on dishcloths or face cloths or baby blankets or maybe just afghans, and you want to venture into garment making. Maybe you've always dreamed of knitting a sweater, but you just don't know how to figure out the sizing. Well, I'm here to tell you that when it comes to knitting, size matters. So you might be thinking, how do I figure out size? Well, let's talk about that a bit today. On every pattern, when you look at the pattern, it will tell you what the gauge is that you are to knit your pattern in. So let me come around and I'll show you what that looks like. So the pattern that I'm currently starting is called the Est Rio Wrap. And you can see that when you look on the instructions, you'll find here where it says on the gauge that 22 stitches and 29 rows in stockinette stitch equals 4 inches. And that is the measurement that is required to make it the size that is intended by the designer. It's very important in a pattern that you have the right gauge, because if the size of your stitch is other than what the pattern calls for, your sizing isn't going to turn out correct. Now this particular pattern is it's just a throw that you put over your head, kind of like a poncho, and it fits very loose. And so if the size isn't exact, it's probably not something to have a heart attack about. But a lot of projects there are. So I'm going to go ahead and make a gauge swatch anyway, especially since the yarn that I want to use for my project is different than the yarn that is recommended by the designer of this particular pattern. So what I will end up doing is casting on the 22 stitches like the pattern says. And then I will sit back and I will knit for 29 rows. And once I've knit those 29 rows, I can take out a measuring stick, just a ruler or anything that you have, and measure to see if the swatch measures 4-inch square when it's just slightly stretched. And if it does, then your gauge is correct. If it doesn't, you might want to adjust your needle size. I happen to be a tight knitter, and I know that typically when I do a gauge swatch, my gauge swatch is just a tiny bit smaller than a 4-inch. So typically when I'm doing a pattern, I know to size up one needle, or if I'm using a larger yarn than the pattern calls for, I may, adjust my needle size accordingly. So it's something that you may need to play with. And I highly recommend it, because although in the early stages of knitting you might feel like you're sitting and spending a lot of time working on a little swatch and then you're just pulling it back out. I remember the first time I did that, I just literally, as I unraveled it, saw 4 hours just ravel away. But now I can knit up a gauge swatch in just a few minutes, and it's well worth the investment of time. So I would encourage you to do so. All right, well, we'll see you back in here the next time with the Twisted Pearl Girl. Thanks for stopping by.